Extra credits each week, everyone, for anyone who can remind me to press record. You can get the degree just on reminder credits. So hopefully we're back to full screen for you guys out there. Wow, I'm so grateful for that. Right, so yeah, as I was saying, these Olympic rings may appear to be intertwined, but of course they're not. This is where graphic designers are really good at implying things that are not there. This is where an exercise in minimalism is a really good training for any graphic designer. You know, you look at a roundabout and the lines on the road give you an idea as to which direction you're meant to be rotating. This is graphic suggestion giving you instruction in the same way that the principles of Gestalt come into play. So if you look at this roundabout and you look at the T-junctions, of course, but you're looking at a visual instruction that helps the flow and direction of the piece of work. And this panda for the World Wildlife Fund is a classic example of Gestalt psychology. And in fact, it's one of the principles called closure. I will come on to the principles and we'll include this piece when we do. We'll go into more detail then. So just recap, according to the basic Gestalt psychology, the whole is different from the sum of the parts. Just remember that. Not greater, but different. I think I've said that several times to help you remember. So all the principles under Gestalt represent how people see various visual elements under certain outside conditions. The message that your design gives to the audience will depend on various key elements that are covered by these principles. And whilst there are several principles that Gestalt theory define, we're going to look into the main 5 ones, which are figure ground, similarity, proximity, closure, and continuity. There are a couple more, but these are the main ones that definitely will come into play in your work. So if we look into figure ground, effectively, figure ground is probably one of the most important aspects of Gestalt psychology. It is, as the title suggests, being able to differentiate between the foreground and the background, and how through good design that can imply a reversal, leaving the audience wondering whether they're looking at something in the foreground or whether that item in the foreground happens to be the background. To put that kind of clearly, the eye differentiates an object from its surrounding area. A form or shape is perceived as a figure, whilst the surrounding area is perceived as the ground. Not rocket science. Just like this vase, which is a classic example that's used in lectures like this to explain the principles of figure ground. Whereas you see the vase because it's the darker object, but then you have to question yourself, well, is the vase the foreground object, or is the vase the background to side profile faces facing each other? So it's this optical illusion that figure ground plays with all the time. So during this presentation, I'm going to spend a lot of time showing you great examples of the application of these principles. So it's going to be a very visual presentation for you today. If we look at figure ground in the arts, some of you may be familiar with the work of N.C. Escher, a prolific optical artist in the 20th century. He was the master of figure ground in his artwork. If you look at this piece of work, Sophie confirms that he's a legend. Indeed he is. There are other examples of his work. This is a very famous piece where the fish below the horizon line then morph into the flying seagulls above the horizon line. Again, classic example of Gestalt's design in terms of figure ground. And you see really a lot of figure ground principle in op art and pattern design. You can see from this example. And of course, Magritte used the principle of figure ground quite a lot, in fact. You'll be familiar with these examples of his work. So you've got to put this into context. This work was being produced at the same time as the theory was evolving, and artists were quick to incorporate these principles into their work. So figure ground in graphic design. Mostly you will find figureground comes in handy when it comes to logo design and corporate identity. This mark for Network USA uses figureground in a very simple yet poignant way. Clearly, the S is the use of figureground there. And a classic example is the FedEx logo. If anyone can see why or how, if not, the arrow between the E and the X, or the arrow that's formed between the relationship of the E and the X. All of a sudden, because we see the arrow is now in the foreground. Can this also be referred to as a negative space? Indeed, it can, Tyler. Yeah. The F1 logo, again, example of figureground. And yes, you could say, Tyler, negative space too. Same with Amazon. The smile is an arrow from A to Z. Yeah, we're actually going to include that when talking about one of the other principles. People is saying, oh. This logo or mark for sleep well, soft as a cloud. Again, it's like such a lovely, simple, sweet piece of design using the principle of figureground. Massimo Vignelli is the corporate designer, or was the corporate designer for Knoll Furniture. This lovely, sweet Christmas offering uses, again, figureground in the bow that ties together the two L's in the company name. And whilst the Apple logo is not an example of figureground, it's just an apple with a bite out of it. But the reason I'm showing you it is because an adapted version of this logo, when Steve Jobs died, the Apple logo is an example of figureground with the silhouette of Steve Jobs. Another great example, Girl Scouts. In fact, several uses of figureground are in play there. This graphic mark for dental implants, the screw is silhouetted against the tooth, although the screw could easily be the root of the tooth as well. And this example, as simple as it is, again, the dog is either in the foreground or the background, depending which way you read it. The idea of figureground is that you're meant to be able to read it both ways on each occasion. It's got to work both as negative and positive. Black cat lounge, black cat, cocktail, and yet it conveniently doubles up as just simply a cat with a long tail, or is it a cocktail in front of the cat? Another great example, the yogurt Australia, forming the shape of Australia itself in the yoga position. And this example for Melbourne Food and Wine Festival. So figureground in illustration. So we've seen kind of like the graphic perspective, and hopefully we will have some illustrators watching this video later. They're in class at the moment, so they don't get to watch it live, for their benefit and for our benefit, because we're visual mark makers as well. This is a good example of figureground used in illustration. If you can identify how it's a cliffside, a rock face, you then see the side profile of a girl's face looking from top right to bottom left. Can you see that? Cool. A more obvious example, very clear use of figureground. And this one here, if you're able to utilize as an illustrator or an image maker, this principle, it just adds a certain magic to the kind of work that you do. In poster design, excellent examples of figureground. And some of you may be familiar with the campaign that was produced for the release of the Batman movie. You can see if I turn this poster upside down, it works in both orientations. So you've got Penguin one way and Batman the other. This image for Lord of the Rings, again, is using figureground. Campaign for child abuse, I believe, domestic violence. Not sure what the campaign is, but you can see the use of figureground. Another really good example here, the map of Africa, mother and child. And even in the West End, you see evidence of figureground used in contemporary poster design. So I would say figureground is one of the rock star principles of Gestalt psychology. All right, so that's figureground, nicely embedded. So let's look at the principles of similarity. I'll explain first what they are. Effectively, similarity is to do with how things are perceived as a group. If I just explain, It's when objects look similar to one another, the viewer will perceive them as a group or pattern. These can be similar in color, shape, texture, or any other aspect of design elements. I'll show you by example. So you see, you take this block of characters. They're all very similar to each other. In fact, they're identical. This is similarity. Now, the reason why it's called similarity rather than pattern is because one of those odd principles that we use similarity, but we use it with the purpose of breaking the pattern. So, for instance, when objects are similar, another object can be emphasized if it is different from the others. This is known as an anomaly or focus or visual irritant, and is an additional feature of the similarity principle. I'm really going to have to show you this by example. Take this grid of squares. The pattern is broken by the circle. In fact, the pattern is broken in two ways, by the addition of the circle and also by the addition of the color. So that's the principle of similarity, but how it's used to create emphasis. So going back to our original image of our characters in a row, we applied that in the same way. And so now we add meaning to the piece, depending on what it is that you're trying to say. You take this logo here, which could have been simply these paper cutout characters from left to right, but there is a degree of similarity until you reach the fourth character, and that's the anomaly in the pattern that is set. I'll show you some examples in graphic design. Take this logo for NBC. The similarity is in the petals. The petals are all the same dimension, and they all follow the same rotation. The pattern is broken, as you'll notice, by the subtlety of the beak of the peacock, breaking the convention of similarity. Another example, very much the same principle. You've got this pattern of spikes, which are representing radiating sun. But then you've got the eagle head, which owes itself to the bottom three spikes forming its head. So the pattern, again, is broken to create the mark. In poster design, very simple principle. It's back to the circles and squares again, but this time making it literal with the climber there. And famously, the Beatles album cover, A Hard Day's Night, the break in the pattern is the second row middle image. It's the only one where the face isn't shown and it's the back of the face. So again, it's a break in the pattern that makes it intriguing. A similarity in art, you don't have to look very far to realize that that's exactly what Andy Warhol was doing with his installation of Campbell's soup. Can you see the break in the pattern? The entire purpose of this piece.
Second row, third in.
Second row, third in. Opal says, yeah. And I guess Andy Warhol was also relying on similarity when creating his screen prints for his Marilyn Monroe collection. Similarity in photography, good example here. You're immediately drawn to the main character because of the break in the pattern. And what makes this photograph so dramatic, so exciting, is that the pattern is broken by the human inclusion staring out into the horizon. So, similarity. Now, proximity is when objects are placed close to each other, they are often perceived as a group. This occurs obviously when items are placed close to each other. The position of these elements help to portray a relationship between the separate parts. The opposite can also be true. I'll show you by example. Say you take these squares. They appear to have no relationship to each other, and indeed they're randomly scattered, whereas the same 9 squares now have a relationship with each other. Now, this might seem like a very basic principle, but it can become a very useful tool in visually dividing the way that you present information and how you group elements so as to create relationships on the page. It can also be used to create figurative or narrative content simply by placement. By the proximity and juxtaposition of things, you can add a new narrative to the piece. So bear that one in mind. It's not so much composition, because we'll go into that in more detail, but this is more about proximity and juxtaposition of elements. So proximity in art. Shearer, when he painted this walk in the park, this image was all about the relationship between certain characters in the scene. There must be over 50 stories to be told in this single piece. Proximity in graphic design. If you look at the Unilever logo, that's a classic example of elements coming together in close proximity whilst creating a whole. This poster for McDonald's launching restaurant Wi-Fi is another excellent example of how proximity can be used to add narrative. Proximity in photography. You only have to go to an air show to see how formations can be used to display the principle. This is an excellent example, good use of proximity again, when things come together to create a second meaning. I think this was a poster or a magazine cover paying homage to the Boston Marathon bombing. Really lovely, subtle use of proximity, where you can see the handles of the knives, spoons, and forks forming the shape or the configuration of a piano keyboard. And this example, again, if it wasn't for the right position, it would be a wasted opportunity. So that's proximity. Not exactly the rock star of figure ground, but I'll tell you what is a rock star, and that is closure. This is a principle that you'll apply an awful lot to your work at its best. When gaps appear between shapes, people tend to mentally want to close those shapes down and form a perception of the whole object. Effectively, closure occurs because it's human condition to want to do so. If enough of the shape is there to indicate or hint at the complete picture, the viewer subconsciously fills in the missing information. I wonder how many of you can read what's on screen at the moment. Can you fill in the missing pieces?
I'm sure they will be able to understand the silence.
Very good. So you've done that by simply filling in what's not there. So Cameron was correct. So I'm sure that you will be able to understand the sentence. Equally, if you have the ability to read this text, it's a sign that Gestalt is at work. And yet there must be at least 20 typos in it. The human brain is wired to want to complete the picture. And all it needs at any given time is just enough of a clue to be able to achieve that. So what you're looking at is not 3 Pac-Men, but effectively a black triangle against a black background. You are looking at a white square against a white background, purely because that's what the eye wants to see. And this is a very, very powerful device. You've got to remember that before this theory was fully appreciated and fully realized, most logos were very literal. And this would have been just outrageous at the time. I mean, you can take it blank further. There are lots of examples if you do some research on the subject. It's a clever one because this one, again, the eye is convinced that it's a circular ball with spikes coming off it, a bit like what are those mines? Is it a mine? Water mine. And this one even has perspective and a sense of depth. What do you see when you see this image?
Person sat down.
Ah, right, you see that. Sophie sees the horse and Opal sees the horse. Yeah, most people would see a rider on a horse with a rider, Opal says, yeah. Yeah, with a subtle level of information. Now that's a really good example. What do you see here? Any guesses? I'm asking them out there, right? Oh, harder than the, yeah. You see a man staring, Monica sees a man staring into the frame. Yeah, very good. And so, what do you see?
There's a tree shadow in the background.
Animal walking away, a Dalmatian. So no one sees 2 baby seals being beaten to death by a single club. Am I the only one? Dog with a person sitting. Oh, where's the person?
There's a tree.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, that's actually a good observation because I thought that was the tree because of the shadow around it. So that person sitting is probably a tree branch, a tree stump. Very good. Yeah, there's the dog. And it is a Dalmatian by the looks of it. So closure in graphic design. Let's have a look at some fine examples. So we saw these images from get-go. Those are really good examples of closure because you're able to complete the picture. So yeah, back to the panda and why it's used on many occasions in presentations like this. You see how the eye is left to complete what is not there. So it's really good, especially when you are designing clever graphics, to use the principle of closure. Don't put an outline around everything. Give the audience some opportunity to engage in a piece of design. Same can be said for this whale, and it works with Paul Rand's design for IBM. Otto Alsa, for his Olympic pictograms in 1972, used the principle of closure. You don't need to draw an outline. Your brain is completing that picture very successfully. And remember, there's 30 other pictograms that use that same principle in that campaign. So again, it's like a master of the principle. So closure in illustration, some good examples here. Again, so I mean, really the short of it is, it's the mastering the art of the incomplete so that you can give the audience some degree of satisfaction of being able to figure out what the image is without it being completely spelled out for them. And that's what makes graphic design magical. So this image for the famous Guggenheim Museum in New York, very famous for its architectural structure. Watch that game on. And clever use of black and white imagery. Again, not a single outline, just sort of suggestion. And the eye is completing the image. Another example here of this giraffe. I assume you can see the giraffe. Closure in photography. So a great example, which is this hand unscrewing a light bulb. What light bulb, you might ask? That's the whole point of using this principle. Be able to create an image in the mind's eye of the audience without actually using that image. It's a very powerful tool if it's applied correctly. And finally, continuity, which is all about flow, really. This occurs when the human eye follows the direction from one object to another, perceiving separate objects as one. I'll explain that in more detail. So continuation occurs when the human eye is compelled to move through one object and continue to another object. Often this is used in typography-based logos. I'll show you some examples in a moment. But if you look at these dots, the human eye, the human condition, first and foremost, has a desire to go with the flow. So you're looking at two dotted lines, each crossing in the middle. And yet you're making that decision through proximity and also a genuine understanding of continuation, flow and direction. But we call it continuity. To illustrate that in another way, you've got this arch with a line going straight across it in the top left-hand corner. The two examples on the left, whereas the ones on the right are a contradiction. You would never see that configuration of dots, believing that they are following that journey, the ones on the right. In the same way that you wouldn't contradict the curved line. So it's clear that the human condition loves to go with the flow. That's a really important principle to follow. So you take these dots here, they're not randomly selected, but they are carefully positioned to give a sense of direction and movement. And yet it's only positioning. In the same way that these curves are leading the eye from the bottom left-hand corner all the way through the page to the top left-hand corner. And that's because you're going with the flow. Perhaps it's going to be easier to fully appreciate it when we look at examples, starting with the arcs. Most of you will be familiar with Lissitzky's constructivist piece. But what you've got with the red triangle is a strong sense of direction, adding to the narrative. So the arrow is going into the circle, whereas you get it in op art as well, whereas you got the flow going like a stream away from the bottom right and then diminishing into the top left. And then, of course, we can go back to Escher with examples of flow and continuation. But for us, we apply those principles, you could argue, in a much sophisticated way, whilst being masters of minimalism. Take a logo like this. We break the rhythm of the piece with the cue in the middle and this river, which goes to the call to action. And again, the tail of the cue is helping the flow, the eye, the direction that the eye chooses to read the piece. without some hint as to continuity and the flow, this would be space star, whereas the two come together and create a whole. And of course, yes, as mentioned earlier, a great example is the Amazon logo. Obviously, the arrow doubles up as a smile, but it's also making very clear that the service on offer is anything from A to Z, created with continuity and flow. Continuation in photography. You see it all the time. Some of the best photography has a sense of direction of movement, encouraging the eye to go from A to B. Whether you're a professional photographer or an amateur photographer, it's a really important technique to use to have a strong sense of depth and direction. So to recap, which principles are being used in the following logos? We're going to look at just a small selection of Olympic logos designed over the last, say, 100 years. Most of them are more recent than that. And I want you to use your chat or just call out by turning on your microphone which of the 5 principles I've just shown you are actually being applied to the design of that logo. Now, bear in mind that these principles are not used exclusively. It is possible to use more than one principle at any given time. So it can include figure ground, but it can also include proximity, continuity, the like so. We're going to look at some of these pictogram logos, and I want you to shout out, tell me which ones you think are in play. So if you look at the Beijing 2008, which Gestalt principle immediately comes to mind?
Closure.
Closure. Al says closure. He beat you to it, online people. Get in there, Al. Yeah, so a simple device, but now it's fully understood that obviously it's a running figure against what appears to be a precious gem like jade, which I know has significant meaning in the Asian culture. I think it's meant to be a gem representing good fortune. And so combining the two, so it's obviously a figure ground. Yeah. And what about the LA 1984 Olympics? Remember I said many designs include more than one principle. Anyone online want to count? How's the guess?
Figure ground.
I think it's proximity
Proximity and what, Sophie?
in the stars.
I didn't catch that. Let's go.
Proximity in the stars.
Oh yeah, definitely proximity in the stars. There's something else in the stars as well. Can you see it?
More closure?
Definitely closure, because you're completing the picture. It's a bit like the IBM logo in that respect. If you look at the white star, what do you think that one is doing? Yeah, begins with F. Figure ground? We're all figure ground. Oh, well done, Sophie. Well done for spotting that. And what about the Salt Lake Olympics? I would say the Salt Lake are a similarity insofar as there's a pattern, but there's a break in the pattern, which is interesting, because it's giving some kind of narrative information there. And there's also closure, because it's not a complete image, so you're closing the gaps. Vancouver, 2010, could be another example of closure. You could say proximity of items that come together to form the piece. What about Sochi, 2014?
Is there an anomaly in the dot or U to make that stand out as just the web URL, but then similarity in the rest of it being some sort of shaping?
Yeah, well, actually, that's a good observation, because both the dot or U, which are deliberately treated with the same finish, so there's an attempt to group them, isn't there? So you've got two groups. You've got the Sochi 2014 as one group, separate from the .ru, so that you read it down. So you've got grouping going on, which is the principle of...
proximity.
So that's the proximity, yeah. But also you've got continuity in terms of the flow from left to right, which gives you that strong line, which also doubles up as a reflection, because Sochi is a coastal venue, backdrop of mountains, and then you've got the lake, and that's meant to represent the reflection in the water. Quite clever, really. And finally, the Paris 2024 logo, which hopefully in a couple of years you'll all become familiar with. Anyone online who can tell? The what?
Figure ground.
Figure ground, Rick says figure ground, and Rick would be correct. You can see that it works on, for its simplicity in the most beautiful way. You've got the circle, that could represent the gold medal, but then you've got the Olympic torch, and then you've got the face, which apparently the narrative behind this is that they want to push forward the awareness of women in athletics during the games. But I think it's also representing Marie Antoinette as a little bit of a legacy of French culture. So well done, everyone. That was really good. You spotted them all. So that's just, like an introduction to the principles of Gestalt psychology. Obviously, it's something that's best applied rather than just read about or listened to, but use the principles and you'll just find that your work takes on just a different dynamic entirely. So we're going to now press ahead to the principles of visual hierarchy and visual perception, but I'm going to give you all a 10-minute break. So it's 12:15 now. Let's go and make a coffee, go and have a cigarette, go to the loo, whatever you want to do, but be back seated and online for 12:25. The principles of perception is the shorter half of this presentation. So it's quite snappy and it's by examples as well. So just to give you an idea of timing so that you can pace yourself for the afternoon. So is everyone okay for a 10-minute break? Just thumbs up in the chat or just simply turn on your mic or whatever you want to do. I'm reading the thread now. Thumbs up from Opal, from Sophie, Bobina, and Tyler. All right, so you're all saying, cool, great. So see you all in 10 minutes time at 12:25, and we'll take it from there.